Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Tell me where you're watching from now, because the story I'm about to tell has traversed mountains, silences, and entire generations without ever being fully understood. It was the year 1834. West Virginia did not yet exist as a separate state. It was merely the western portion of Virginia, a land of immense mountains covered in dense forests where sunlight barely penetrated. The Appalachian Mountains loomed like ancient guardians of secrets. They preferred to remain buried. Back then, the region was populated by isolated families, small communities living days apart, connected only by narrow and perilous trails that wound through the deep valleys. Greenbrier County was one of those places where time seemed to move differently. People lived off the land, growing corn and raising pigs in the clearings they could carve out in the impenetrable forest. Life was hard but predictable. Families knew their neighbors, even if they lived miles apart. Everyone knew who was who, where they came from, what stories they carried. It was a community woven by invisible bonds of trust and mutual need. Because in the mountains, you depended on each other to survive the harsh winters that transformed the land into a deadly white desert. It was in this setting that the Hadley family built their lives. The patriarch Isaiah Hadley was 42 when the events began. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, forged by decades of hard labor. His wife Martha was 38 and known for her skill with medicinal herbs, something that earned her both respect and a little fear among her neighbors. They had 7 children. The eldest, Jacob, was 19. Then came Rebecca, 17, Thomas, 15, Mary, 13, Samuel, 11, Elizabeth, 9, and the youngest, little Hannah, just 5. The Hadley homestead lay in the Sinking Creek Valley, a place where the stream mysteriously disappeared into underground caverns before resurfacing miles away. The house was dark wood, built from heavy logs that Isaiah and Jacob had cut and dragged down the mountain. It was 2 stories high, a rarity for the region, a sign that the Hadleys had achieved some prosperity. At the back of the property was a barn where they stored tools, seeds, and winter provisions. Beyond, the forest swallowed everything up. Their closest neighbors were the Cooper family, who lived about 2 miles north along the trail. Beyond them, there was no one for another 10 or 12 miles. The isolation didn't bother the Hadleys. They were self-sufficient, hard-working, and devout. Every Sunday, weather permitting, they made the long walk to the small wooden church that served the entire valley. There they met with other families, exchanged news, and shared concerns about the harvest, the wild animals that sometimes attacked their livestock, and rumors that native tribes still roamed the more remote parts of the mountains. But in late October of that year, something changed. Autumn had arrived with an unusual chill. The leaves fell earlier than expected, and a persistent mist began to rise from the valley each morning, taking until noon to dissipate. People commented on the strange weather, how the forest animals were agitated, how the crows circled over Sinking Creek, cawing incessantly. It was on one of those cold mornings, October 28th, that Samuel Cooper, the eldest son of the neighboring family, passed the Hadley property on his way to Lewisburg for supplies. He waved when he saw Isaiah working in the fields, and Isaiah waved back. Everything seemed normal. Martha was on the porch, supervising the children playing in the yard. Samuel continued on his way, planning to return the same way the next day. When he returned on the evening of the 29th, something was different. The Hadley estate was unusually quiet. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, which was strange because the nights were already freezing. Samuel slowed his pace, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He called out, but no one answered. The pigs were restless in their pen, grunting with hunger. The chickens were scratching freely in the yard, something Martha would never allow. Samuel dismounted and walked to the house. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. He pushed it open and entered, calling out for the Hadleys. The interior was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, dishes were broken on the kitchen floor, and a pot lay overturned near the unlit stove. But no one was there, not Isaiah, not Martha, not any of the 7 children. Samuel ran from room to room. Beds were unmade, clothes strewn about, but no sign of the family. He ran out, searched the barn at the back of the property, and called their names until his voice was nothing. It was as if 9 people had simply vanished between the morning of the 28th and the evening of the 29th. Terrified, Samuel mounted his horse and galloped home. He woke his father and 3 other local men. They grabbed flashlights and returned to the Hadley property that night, searching for clues for any explanation. What they found left them even more disturbed. The men searched the Hadley property until the early hours of the morning. The flickering light of their flashlights revealed details Samuel's initial haste had missed. In the main room, dark marks stained the hardwood floor near the fireplace. They appeared to have been hastily scrubbed, but they were still visible in the direct light. No one wanted to say out loud what they could be, but everyone thought the same thing. In the room Rebecca and Mary shared, the beds were violently torn. The sheets had been ripped off, and one of the pillows was torn with feathers scattered across the floor. In the kitchen, the overturned pot contained the remains of stew that was already beginning to sour. Martha was clearly preparing dinner when something happened. The knife she used to cut vegetables lay on the floor, the blade clean, but its position suggested it had been dropped hard. Thomas Cooper, Samuel's father, was a practical man who had lived in those mountains for 56 years. He had seen bears attack cabins, helped search for lost children in the woods, and witnessed neighborly fights that ended in tragedy. But I had never seen anything like this. An entire family gone missing, leaving no clear trace of what happened or where they went. They checked the doors and windows for signs of forced entry. Nothing. The front door had been opened from the inside, as was obvious from the position of the hinges and latch. Someone in the family had opened that door, either escaping or letting someone in. The windows were all intact, none broken or forced. The barn was also locked from the outside, exactly as it should be. As the sun rose on October 30th, more men arrived. News had already begun to spread through the mountains with that uncanny speed that tragedies have in small communities. 15 men, some with horses. Others who had walked from distant properties gathered in the Hadleys' backyard. They organized themselves into groups and began searching the surrounding area, moving in ever-widening circles from the house. The first group followed the trail that led to the Cooper property. They searched every inch of the path, looking for footprints, for torn clothing in bushes, for any sign that someone had passed by in a hurry. They found nothing but the shoe marks of Samuel's horse from the previous day. The second group descended to Sinking Creek. The water was low at that time of year, and the muddy banks would have held footprints if anyone had passed by recently. They walked along the creek for nearly a mile in each direction, peering into the shallow caves that dotted the slopes, calling the Hadleys' names until their voices echoed off the rock formations. The answering silence was oppressive. The third group entered the dense forest behind the property. It was dangerous territory, full of hidden ravines and cliffs that suddenly appeared between the trees. They moved slowly, alert to every sound, every movement. One of the men, Joshua Miller, found something that made everyone stop. It was a piece of blue fabric, the kind Martha used to use for her dresses, attached to a thorny branch about 300 m into the woods. The fabric was torn jaggedly, as if someone had run without regard for the thorns. Excited by the discovery, they continued in that direction, searching for more signs. 50 m ahead they found another piece of fabric, this one smaller, also blue. Then another, and another. It was as if someone were deliberately leaving a trail, or as if they were being dragged through the vegetation. The men quickened their pace, their hearts pounding, hoping to find Martha, hoping to find any of the Hadleys alive. The trail of fabric led them to a small clearing where sunlight could penetrate. In the center of the clearing was a large flat stone, the kind people sometimes used as a makeshift table during long hunts. On the stone, carefully arranged in a line, were 7 small objects. The men approached slowly, almost afraid to confirm what their eyes saw. They were dolls. 7 dolls made of straw and cloth, the kind mountain children played with. Each was a different size from largest to smallest, all lined up with disturbing precision. The largest doll wore a piece of the same blue cloth they had found in the branches. The others wore scraps the men recognized as the Hadley children's clothing. Little Hannah always wore a faded green dress. The smallest doll was wrapped in faded green cloth. Joshua Miller reached out a trembling hand and picked up one of the dolls. It was damp, as if it had been left there recently, perhaps overnight. When he turned it over, he saw that someone had sewn something onto the back. It was written in a crooked line made with black thread. They saw. The other dolls had similar messages. They know. They told they must be silent. The group ran back to the property carrying the dolls. When they showed them to the other men, a heavy silence fell over everyone. This wasn't the work of wild animals. It wasn't an accident. Someone had taken the Hadley family and had left that macabre message for them to find. But who and why? And most importantly, where were Isaiah, Martha, and the 7 children now? It was decided they needed more qualified help. 2 men mounted their fastest horses and galloped to Louisburg, the nearest town with established authorities. It would be at least a 5-hour drive each way. Meanwhile, the other men continued searching, but now with a growing fear that they were not searching for survivors, but for something far worse. The news reached Louisburg late in the afternoon of October 30th, causing an immediate commotion. Greenbrier County Sheriff William Thornton was a 61-year-old man who had served in the War of 1812 against the British. He had seen combat. He had seen death. But the story the 2 horsemen told left him visibly shaken. He gathered 6 men, including the town physician, Dr. Elias Petton, and set out for the Sinking Creek Valley that night, carrying torches to light the treacherous path. They arrived at the Hadley estate shortly after midnight. The house was dark, but dozens of men still lingered nearby, some standing guard, others simply unable to leave without knowing what had happened to their neighbors. Sheriff Thornton entered the house and examined each room with the meticulousness of someone experienced in reconstructing violent events. Dr. Petton accompanied him, his medical bag in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The dark stains on the floor of the main room caught the doctor's immediate attention. He knelt, took a small glass vial from his case, and scraped off a sample of the stained wood. He held it up to the light of his flashlight and examined it carefully. His face darkened. It was human blood, he was sure. Not much, perhaps the equivalent of a head wound or a deep cut, but definitely blood, and it had been deliberately rubbed in, probably with a cloth that had later been taken away. In the girl's room, Thornton found something the local men had lost in the darkness of the previous night. Under Rebecca's bed, partially hidden by the floor-length fabric skirt, lay a small book. It was Rebecca's diary. Girls from slightly more prosperous families sometimes kept diaries recording thoughts, prayers, and daily events. Thornton carefully picked up the book and opened it to the last written page. The entry was dated October 28th, written in Rebecca's careful handwriting. The first few lines talked about the cold weather, how she'd helped her mother bake bread that morning, how Thomas had complained of back pain after carrying firewood, ordinary, trivial things. But the last few lines were different. The handwriting grew more hurried, the words nearly running off the page. Father's been acting strange since he came back from the woods yesterday. He won't talk to anyone. He just stares at the mountains. Mother is worried, but doesn't say anything. Jacob heard strange sounds coming from the barn last night. He said it sounded like someone crying, but when we went to look, there was no one. I'm scared. Thornton read the passage aloud to the men present. A murmur of unease ran through the group. Had Isaiah gone into the woods 2 days before his disappearance? Why? And what were those sounds Jacob had heard? The sheriff ordered 2 men to go to the barn with flashlights and search more thoroughly. They had looked before, but only superficially. The barn was a sturdy structure with heavy plank walls and a high roof for storing hay. Inside there was the familiar smell of stored grain, leather, and rusty tools. The men began rummaging through every nook and cranny, moving sacks of seed and pushing aside tools hanging on the walls. That's when one of them, Albert Green, stepped on a floorboard which gave slightly under his weight, making a hollow sound. He bent down and examined the board more closely. It wasn't nailed down like the others. It was simply wedged in place as if it had been recently removed and replaced. Albert called his companion, and together they lifted the board. Beneath it was an empty space, a sort of compartment carved into the compacted earth. And within this compartment, illuminated by the flickering light of their flashlights, were objects that made both men instinctively recoil. There were bones, small bones, some still with fragments of tissue attached. There was also a dark leather-bound book, its yellowed pages covered in cramped writing that neither man could decipher at first glance. And there was something more disturbing. A necklace made of teeth, human teeth by the looks of it, strung on a leather cord, 23 in all. The men carried everything into the house and placed it on the kitchen table. Sheriff Thornton examined the bones while Dr. Petton looked at the book. The first few pages were in English, but it was an old, difficult-to-read English. They appeared to be notes on medicinal plants, recipes for teas and ointments. But as the pages progressed, the content changed. Strange diagrams began to appear, circles within circles, symbols that looked like a mix of letters and numbers. On one of the center pages, Pitton found a date, 1796, 38 years earlier, and a name, Sarah Blackwood. He turned to Thornton. "Do you know that name? Anyone from the area?" The sheriff frowned, thinking. Then his eyes widened. Sarah Blackwood. My God, she was hanged in 1797 on charges of witchcraft. One of the last such executions in Virginia. I was just a boy, but I remember the story. They said she had made dark pacts, that she had caused the deaths of several children in a village near here. The men looked at each other, the weight of that revelation settling over them like a cold mountain mist. Why did Isaiah Hadley have a book that belonged to a woman executed for witchcraft? Where did those bones come from? And that necklace of teeth? The questions multiplied, but the answers seemed to ebb away. Thornton decided they needed to examine the site where the dolls were found in broad daylight. But they also needed to interview everyone who had contact with the Hadley family in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Someone must have seen or heard something. Entire families don't simply vanish into the mountains without leaving at least a whisper of evidence. As the sheriff was organizing the next steps of the investigation, one of the men who had been watching the property overnight rushed into the house, his face pale. "There's something you need to see," he said, his voice shaking. No, they all followed the man outside, walking through the yard to the edge of the forest. There, on a thick oak tree about 50 yards from the house, someone had carved words into the bark. The letters were deep, made with a sharp knife, and still relatively fresh. The sap of the tree had run through the marks like dark tears. The words read, "The blood of the mountain claims what is its own. 9 souls to calm the ancient hunger. The pact is renewed." The sun was beginning to rise over the Appalachian Mountains, tinting the sky red and orange, but that natural beauty seemed obscene beside the somber message carved into the oak. Sheriff Thornton knew this was no longer a simple search for missing persons. He was dealing with something much darker, something with deep roots in the land's past, and he feared that before he found answers, he would uncover horrors he wished he had never known. Sheriff Thornton ordered the message on the tree copied word for word into his official records. He knew it would be crucial to understanding what had happened to the Hadleys. As the sun slowly rose over the valley, illuminating the mist that still clung to the hollows of the ground, he gathered his men and began asking systematic questions. Who had seen Isaiah Hadley in the previous weeks? Who had he spoken to? Where exactly had he gone when he entered the woods 2 days before his disappearance? Thomas Cooper, the closest neighbor, was the first to be formally questioned. He sat nervously in a chair on the Hadleys' porch, twisting his hat in his hands. Isaiah was a reserved man, Cooper began, but in the last 3 weeks, maybe 4, he'd become even quieter. He seemed to be carrying a weight. When we met at church in early October, I tried to talk to him about the harvest, about the coming winter. He barely looked me in the eye. He kept looking at the mountains, as if expecting to see something emerge from there. Thornton took careful notes. And Martha, the children, did they show any signs that something was wrong? Cooper thought for a moment. Martha seemed scared. She didn't say anything directly, but a woman doesn't need to speak for fear to be seen. The children were quieter than usual. Jacob, the oldest, had become too serious for a 19-year-old. I remember thinking that maybe they were having financial difficulties, that the harvest hadn't been good. But I didn't imagine it was anything like this. Other men were questioned. Joshua Miller, who had found the dolls in the clearing, revealed something interesting. About 10 days before the disappearance, he had seen Isaiah walking along the trail that led to the higher parts of the mountains carrying a large backpack. It was unusual. That trail led nowhere useful, only to rocky peaks and forests so dense that even experienced hunters avoided them. When Miller asked where Isaiah was going, he simply replied, "To settle old business," and continued walking without looking back. Dr. Pitton, meanwhile, continued poring over Sarah Blackwood's book. Sitting at the kitchen table, he turned the pages carefully, trying to decipher the increasingly chaotic writing that filled the spaces. On one of the final pages, he found something that made him pause. It was a list of names, 17 in all, written in ink that had faded to a dark brown with age. Beside each name was a date. The first name was Elizabeth Warren, 1793. The last was Isaiah Hadley, 1834. Peyton immediately called Thornton. "Look at this. Isaiah was in this book. His name was written this year." The sheriff took the book and studied the list. The other names were unfamiliar, except for 2 or 3 he vaguely recognized as belonging to people who had lived in the area decades ago. People who, now that he thought about it, had died or disappeared under strange circumstances. "We need to find out who these people were," Thornton said, "and we need to understand what this list means. If Isaiah was listed here, then he was involved in something that began long before 1834, something that has been creeping through these mountains for at least 40 years. It was decided that one group would travel to Louisburg to search the county archives for records of these individuals. Another group would continue searching the woods, following the trail Isaiah had taken 10 days earlier. And a third group would interview families living further away to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual in the past few weeks. The group that entered the forest following the high trail consisted of 6 men, all experienced hunters familiar with these mountains. They carried ropes, machetes, 2 days' worth of provisions, and loaded weapons. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt they might find more than just clues to the Hadleys' whereabouts. They might find the Hadleys themselves, and no one expected this encounter to be pleasant. The trail climbed steeply, zigzagging between ancient trees whose trunks were so thick 3 men couldn't hug them. The forest here was different from the one near the Hadley property. It was older, darker, quieter. The birds didn't sing. Squirrels didn't scamper through the branches. It was as if the animals themselves avoided this place. After 4 hours of difficult walking, they reached a rocky plateau. The vegetation thinned here, and grey stone formations rose from the ground like the bones of some buried giant. In the center of the plateau was a structure that brought the men to an abrupt halt. It was a circle of stones, each about a meter high, arranged with mathematical precision. Within the circle, the ground was blackened, as if many fires had been lit there over the years. They approached cautiously. The ground inside the circle wasn't just charred. It was covered in layers of ash that must have accumulated decades ago. And among the ash, when they looked closer, were bone fragments. Many fragments, too small to be from large animals, just the right size to be from children. One of the men, a hunter named Silas Wright, pointed to the other side of the plateau. "Look over there." There was an opening in the rocky face of the mountain, a cave that was invisible from afar because it was partially hidden by thorn bushes. The men looked at each other. None of them wanted to enter that cave, but they all knew they had to. They lit makeshift torches from resin-covered branches and entered. The cave was deeper than they expected. The ceiling gradually dropped, forcing them to bend, then crawl. The air grew colder and more humid with every meter. After about 20 m, the cave opened up again into a natural chamber. What they saw there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The torch light revealed paintings on the cave walls. These weren't ancient paintings by native tribes. They were recent, made with something that looked like charcoal and perhaps blood. They showed human figures, always in groups of 9, always surrounded by repeating symbols. And on the floor of the chamber, arranged in another perfect circle, were 9 mounds of stones. Each mound was approximately the size of a human body. The men began removing the stones from the first hill with trembling hands. They didn't have to dig far. Soon they found cloth, then bones. They were the remains of a person buried there perhaps years before. The cloth had almost completely decomposed, but it was still visible that it had once been a woman's dress. Attached to the bones was a rusty silver medallion. When they opened the medallion, they found inside a lock of brown hair and an inscription, Elizabeth Warren, 1787. Elizabeth Warren, the first name on the list in Sarah Blackwood's book. The men looked at each other, horror growing in their eyes. If this was Elizabeth Warren's grave, then the other 8 mounds likely contained the bodies of the other people on the list. But that meant Isaiah Hadley knew about this place. He had come here, and now his name was on the list too. The men didn't dare open the other 8 mounds on that first visit. The weight of what they had discovered was too overwhelming. They carefully marked the cave's location, carving notches in the trees along the way back, and descended the mountain in heavy silence. When they reached the Hadley property at dusk, they found Sheriff Thornton waiting with equally disturbing news. The group that had gone to Louisburg had returned with records from the county archives. Of the 17 names in Sarah Blackwood's book, they managed to find information on the 13. All had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances over the past 4 decades. Elizabeth Warren disappeared in 1793, leaving behind a husband and 2 young children. She was never found. Jonathan Pierce died in 1798 in a fire that consumed his isolated cabin. Authorities at the time found it strange that an experienced man like Pierce would be trapped in the flames. But they dismissed the case as an accident. Mary Sullivan disappeared in 1802 while walking between her property and her neighbors, a distance of less than a mile. She simply never reached her destination, and so the list went. A succession of tragedies spread over the years, all involving people living in the most isolated regions of the mountains, all without a satisfactory explanation. The pattern only became apparent when you laid them all side by side, as Sheriff Thornton was doing now, spreading documents across his desk. "Look at this," Thornton said, pointing to the dates. "There's a gap between each case, they're not random. From Elizabeth Warren in 1893 to Jonathan Pierce in 1998, 5 years. From Pierce to Mary Sullivan in 1802, 4 years. After that, the gaps get irregular, but never less than 2 years and never more than 7. It's as if someone were following a calendar, waiting for the right moment." Peaton, who had remained at the estate studying Sarah Blackwood's book, looked up. "I found something that might explain this. In the central pages of this book, there are references to specific lunar cycles to star alignments. Sarah Blackwood believed, or at least wrote, that certain rituals could only be performed when the celestial conditions were right. And she mentioned something she called the blood covenant of the mountains. According to what is written here, this covenant required periodic renewal through sacrifice. The word sacrifices fell over the group like a stone dropped into still water, creating waves of silent horror. No one wanted to accept what it implied, but the evidence was mounting inexorably. The dolls in the clearing, the messages carved into the tree, the graves in the cave, the book with names and dates. Everything pointed to the same horrific conclusion. There had been a string of ritual murders taking place in the Appalachian Mountains for over 40 years, and Isaiah Hadley had somehow become part of it. But how? Why? Isaiah was known as a devout, hard-working man, a good father. What could have driven him to something so dark? Thornton decided they needed to speak to the Reverend at the Hadleys' church. If anyone knew about Isaiah's spiritual struggles, it was Reverend Abel Morrison. Morrison was a 73-year-old man who had served this small community for more than 3 decades. When Thornton and 2 deputies arrived at his modest wooden house near the church, the Reverend greeted them with a look that mixed sadness and something that seemed like guilt. "I've been waiting for you," he said, inviting them in. "I knew I would eventually need to tell you what I know." Sitting in the simple room, lit only by dim candlelight, Morrison began to speak. "Isaiah came to me about 2 months ago. He was visibly disturbed, almost feverish. He said he'd found something in the woods while hunting. An ancient object buried beneath a stone marked with strange symbols. It was the book you should have now." Sarah Blackwood's book, Morrison continued, his voice lowering almost a whisper. "Isaiah was obsessed with that book. He came back here repeatedly, wanting to know about Sarah Blackwood, about her trial, about what had happened before her execution. I told him what I knew. Sarah had been accused of causing the deaths of 6 children in a village near here. They said she performed rituals in the mountains, that she had made a pact with ancient forces to gain power. When they captured her, she didn't deny it. She just laughed and said the pact wouldn't die with her, that others would come and continue what she had started." The Reverend reached for a glass of water with trembling hands. "Isaiah asked me if I believed in curses, if it was possible for someone to be bound by a pact made by someone else decades earlier. I told him no, that these were superstitions, that true faith protected against such things, but he wasn't convinced. The last time I saw him 3 weeks ago, he said something that has haunted me ever since. He said, 'Reverend, what if the pact isn't something you choose? What if it's something that chooses you? What if the only way to protect your family is to take someone else's place?'" Thornton felt a shiver run down his spine. He said that take someone else's place. Morrison nodded slowly. "Yes, and when I asked him what he meant, He just shook his head and left. I never saw him again. I never saw any of them again. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture none of the men present wanted to accept. Isaiah had found the book. He had learned about the rituals, about the pattern of disappearances, and somehow he had convinced himself he was being called to continue Sarah Blackwood's work. But why? What could make a devout man with 7 children believe he needed to perform human sacrifices? There's more, Morrison said, standing and walking to a bookshelf. He pulled out a small wooden box and opened it. Inside were letters, several of them, all in Isaiah's handwriting. He sent these to me over the last few weeks. I didn't show them to anyone, because I thought they were the ravings of a sick man. But now I see they were confessions. Thornton took the letters and began to read. The writing was jumbled, sometimes incoherent, but certain passages were terrifyingly clear. In one letter Isaiah wrote, "The voices in the mountains won't stop. They call to me every night. They say my family is marked, that the blood debt must be paid. They say if I don't obey, something worse will come for us all." In another letter he wrote, "I have met the others who came before me. There remains rest in the sacred chamber. Each tried to flee the call. Each failed. Now I understand there is no escape. Only the choice of when and how to fulfill the pact." And in the last letter, dated 2 days before his disappearance, Isaiah wrote in nearly illegible handwriting, "Forgive me, Reverend. Forgive me, God, but I cannot let others suffer for my cowardice. If 9 souls are required, then let them be mine and the ones I love. At least then we control our destiny. At least then we will not be hunted like animals. When the moon changes phases again tomorrow night, when the stars are aligned, as the book indicates, I will take my family to the mountain. We will do together what needs to be done, and maybe, just maybe, this will break the cycle forever." The silence that followed the reading of that last letter was so thick it seemed to suck the air from the room. Thornton let the pages fall to the table, his hands shaking visibly. The truth was even more horrific than any scenario they had imagined. Isaiah had not been the victim of an external attack. He had deliberately led his own family to their deaths, believing that doing so would somehow break an ancient curse. "We need to go back to that cave," Thornton said, standing abruptly. "Now, if Isaiah took the family there 7 days ago, there might still be a chance we could find some survivors. The little children, maybe Martha, might have survived, might be hiding somewhere on the mountain." But Dr. Peaton shook his head slowly, his face grim. "Sheriff, 7 days without food, without water in the mountains at this time of year, the nights are dropping below freezing. Even if someone had managed to escape, the chances of survival are slim." Still, no one wanted to give up without absolute certainty. A group of 12 men was quickly organized. They brought ropes, flashlights, blankets, water, and food, preparing to spend the night on the mountain if necessary. They set out at dusk on that October 31st, following the markings the men had made in the trees during the first expedition. The climb was difficult in the dark, but no one complained. Every man there felt the weight of urgency, no matter how unlikely it was to find anyone alive. They reached the rocky plateau around 10:00 at night. The moon was full, casting a ghostly silvery light over the stone circle. The ash in the center seemed to glow subtly in the light, and the men could see that fresh ash had been recently added. Someone had lit a fire there in the last few days, a large fire, judging by the amount of charred remains. They approached the cave with weapons drawn, unsure of what to expect. The entrance was exactly as they had left it, but now they could see footprints in the loose earth around it. Footprints of varying sizes, adults and children, all leading into the cave, none leading out. Thornton entered first, his flashlight casting dancing shadows on the damp walls. The air inside the cave was different now. There was a smell not present before, a sweet cloying scent that everyone recognized immediately. It was the smell of death. The group moved slowly through the narrow tunnel until they reached the main chamber. What they saw there confirmed their worst fears. The 9 cans had been dismantled. The ancient bones had been carefully removed and arranged in a circle on the cave floor, and in the center of this circle of ancient bones, arranged like the petals of a macabre flower, lay 9 new bodies. Isaiah Hadley was in the center, lying on his back with his eyes open, staring at the cave ceiling as if contemplating something only he could see. Around him, in carefully arranged positions, were Martha and the 7 children, all dressed in clean clothes, as if they had prepared for some ceremony. All dead, but with no visible injuries. It was as if they had simply lain there and decided to stop living. Dr. Peton knelt beside Isaiah's body, examining it by the light of his flashlight. There are no signs of violence, no wounds, no signs of a struggle. He checked the other bodies one by one and found the same thing. It's as if they were put to sleep, possibly poisoned with something that left no outward signs. In Isaiah's hand, pressed against his chest, was Sarah Blackwood's book. Thornton carefully removed it and opened it. A new page had been added, written in Isaiah's handwriting. The words were clear, written in fresh ink. On the 29th day of October 1834, under the full moon of the month of harvest, I fulfilled the covenant Sarah Blackwood initiated. 9 souls I gave willingly, so that the cycle could finally close. My own life and the lives of those I love most. There was no pain. I gave them tea of the herbs the book described, and they slept peacefully. Then I drank the same. If you are reading this, know that I did what I thought necessary. May God have mercy on my soul, for I have none. Beside the book was a small empty glass vial with dark residue at the bottom. Peanut sniffed it carefully. Belladonna probably mixed with other herbs. In high doses, it causes deep sleep followed by respiratory arrest. They didn't suffer, at least not physically. Joshua Miller, who had remained near the chamber's entrance, called to the others, "There's something else here. Look at the walls." The paintings they had seen before were different. New markings had been added. Among the ancient symbols, Isaiah had drawn 9 new figures, all holding hands, forming a circle. And above them, written in large letters, was the phrase, "Let this be the last sacrifice." The men carried the bodies out of the cave with silent reverence. Even knowing what Isaiah had done, it was impossible not to feel a deep sadness as they carried the small body of Hannah, just 5 years old, who would never have the chance to grow up, to marry, to have a family of her own. Each child represented a future stolen, not by a cruel killer, but by a father consumed by irrational fears and dark beliefs. The descent from the mountain took all night. They arrived at the Hadley property just as the sun was beginning to rise on November 1st. Other men and women from the community were already gathered there, waiting for news. When they saw the bodies being brought in one by one, wrapped in blankets, a collective wail rose from the crowd. Mothers wept for Martha and the children. Men looked away, unable to process how something like this could have happened in their peaceful community. Reverend Morrison held a simple funeral service 3 days later. The 9 caskets were buried side by side in the church's small cemetery. There was bitter debate over whether Isaiah should be buried in consecrated ground, given what he had done. But Morrison argued that no man was beyond God's mercy, and that Isaiah had been both victim and perpetrator, consumed by something he could neither understand nor combat. News of what happened spread through Virginia like wildfire. Newspapers from Richmond, Charleston, and even farther afield published articles about the mountain tragedy, as it became known. Some journalists even came to Greenbrier to try to interview people, but were met with hostility. The community wanted to forget, to bury the story along with the bodies, but not everything could be buried. Sheriff Thornton had questions gnawing at him. If Isaiah had kept the pact as he believed, did that mean the cycle was truly broken? Or would others in the future find that cursed book and be consumed by the same obsessions? And most importantly, why had Sarah Blackwood started it in the first place? What had happened to her to transform her into someone capable of creating something so horrific? Sheriff Thornton decided he couldn't let those questions go unanswered. The community wanted to forget, but he felt a duty to the 9 souls who had been lost. He needed to understand the origin of this evil to be certain it was truly over. In the days following the funeral, he devoted all his time to investigating Sarah Blackwood's story, delving into old files that had been stored in dusty basement and forgotten trunks. What he discovered painted a very different picture than he expected. Sarah Blackwood hadn't started out as a shadowy figure devoted to macabre rituals. She had been a respected healer, a midwife who helped local women through difficult births. Born in 1762, she had learned her craft from her own mother, who in turn had learned from her grandmother. The Blackwood family had a line of healers that stretched back generations. Everything changed in 1791. That year, according to records Thornton found, a mysterious illness struck the small community where Sarah lived. It started with the children. High fevers, delirium, convulsions. Sarah tried everything, using every herb and treatment she knew. But one by one, 6 children died over the course of 3 months. Among them were Sarah's 2 children, an 8-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. The community, desperate for answers and consumed by grief, began to whisper that Sarah was responsible. After all, she had treated all the children who died. Perhaps her herbs were poison. Perhaps she was experimenting. The accusations mounted until in 1792, Sarah was formally charged with witchcraft and murder. During the trial, which lasted only 2 days, witnesses claimed to have seen her walking alone through the mountains at night, talking to the trees, performing strange rituals. Her only real crime, Thornton realized as she read the documents, had been grief. She was processing the death of her own children, the only way she knew how, through connection with nature, through ancient prayers her grandmother had taught her. But in a frightened community looking for a scapegoat, this was enough to convict her. Thornton found the account of a witness who had been present at the execution. The description was disturbing. Sarah was led to the gallows on March 15, 1797. She did not cry, did not beg for mercy. She stood silently as the executioner adjusted the rope around her neck. But in the moment before the platform fell, she spoke. Her last words were recorded by the clerk. "You kill an innocent and call it justice. Well then, let the mountains remember this injustice. Let every generation pay the price for the blood you spilled today. Not by my hand, for I will be dead, but by the tormented souls of those who see. The weight of guilt will be their curse." It wasn't a pact with dark forces. It was a curse born of despair and injustice. Sarah hadn't started a tradition of sacrifice. She had spoken the words of a broken woman who had seen her life, her children, and her reputation taken from her. But those words had found fertile ground in the fear and superstition that permeated those mountains. Thornton realized something crucial. Every person on the book's list had been part of the community that condemned Sarah or were direct descendants of those people. Elizabeth Warren was the daughter of the judge who presided over the trial. Jonathan Pierce was the grandson of the man who had first publicly accused Sarah. Mary Sullivan was the niece of one of the key witnesses, and Isaiah Hadley, his great-grandfather, had been the executioner who executed Sarah Blackwood. The revelation washed over Thornton like ice water. There was no ancient ritual, no supernatural entity demanding sacrifices. There was only the crushing weight of guilt passed down through generations. Every person on the list had learned in some way about their connection to the injustice committed against Sarah. And that knowledge, combined with the book Sarah had kept, the stories circulating, and the fear of the lonely mountains, had been enough to destroy them. Tyre had found the book and discovered that his great-grandfather had been the executioner of an innocent woman. He had read about the supposed curse. He had seen the pattern of deaths and disappearances, and in his tormented mind, he had concluded that the only way to protect his family from the fate he believed was sealed was to fulfill what he thought was a pact. But it had all been an illusion, a tragedy born of guilt, fear, and a distorted interpretation of past events. Thornton sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of old documents, and felt a deep weariness. Isaiah had killed himself and his entire family, trying to break a curse that never existed. The other people on the list had likely suffered similar fates, consumed by paranoia and despair upon discovering their connection to Sarah Blackwood's death. But there was still a question nagging at him. How had each of these people learned about the book? How had each of them been led to that rocky plateau, that cave? There had to be something more, some invisible thread connecting all these events across the decades. That's when he remembered something Reverend Morrison had mentioned. Isaiah had said he found the book buried under a marked stone. But how had he known where to look? Thornton went back to the letters Isaiah had sent to the Reverend and read them more carefully. In one of them there was a line he had missed before. "The old man told me where to find the book. He said it was my turn to carry the burden as he had before me." What old man? Isaiah never mentioned his name. Thornton began investigating the older neighbors in the area who might have had contact with Isaiah. After days of interviews, one name kept cropping up. Ezekiel Marsh, a hermit who lived high in the mountains, rarely descending to civilization. The few who knew him said he was in his 80s, perhaps even 90s. No one knew exactly where he came from or when he settled there. Thornton organized an expedition to find Ezekiel Marsh. He took 4 men with him and several days' provisions, as no one knew exactly where the old man lived. They followed vague reports from hunters who occasionally saw smoke rising from an isolated cabin in a remote valley north of the rocky plateau. It took 3 days of searching, but they finally found the cabin. It was a primitive structure, built partially into the face of a cliff, using the natural rock as one of the walls. Smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney. Thornton approached cautiously and knocked on the rough wooden door. The door opened slowly, creaking on its rusty hinges. An incredibly old man appeared in the opening. Ezekiel Marsh was so stooped that he barely reached Thornton's shoulder. His skin was like tanned leather, marked by countless years exposed to the sun and mountain wind, but his eyes were surprisingly clear, alert, observing the visitors with a piercing intelligence that belied the frailty of his body. "I've been waiting for you," Ezekiel said, his voice but firm. "It took longer than I thought. I figured you'd come right after finding the Hadleys." He stepped away from the door, gesturing for them to enter. "Come in. I have hot tea and can answer any questions you came to ask." The cabin's interior was surprisingly organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars containing dried herbs, roots, and substances Thornton couldn't identify. Books were stacked high, some so old their covers were falling apart. In the center of the single room sat a rustic table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Ezekiel poured tea into pewter mugs and sat waiting for the men to ask their questions. "Sil knew Isaiah Hadley," Thornton began. "It wasn't a question." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "I did as I knew the others before him, 17 in all over many years. I found each one the same way, guided each one to the same destiny." He sipped his tea, his eyes distant, lost in memories. "I suppose you want to know why. You want to understand what seems incomprehensible. You led them to their deaths," Thornton said, his voice hard. "You deliberately led these people to that cave, gave them the book, planted ideas of curses and pacts in their minds. Why? What kind of monster would do that?" Ezekiel didn't seem offended by the accusation. He just sighed, a weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Monster. Yes, I suppose that's an appropriate word. But before you judge me, let me tell you my story. Then you can decide what to do with me." He struggled to his feet and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the hut. He opened it and removed something wrapped in cloth. When he unrolled it on the table, he revealed a silver medallion tarnished with age. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. "Sarah Blackwood," Ezekiel said, his voice breaking for the first time. "My sister, I was 15 when they executed her. I saw it all. I saw the crowd scream for her blood. I saw the judge ignore every piece of evidence of her innocence. I saw the executioner adjust the rope, and I saw my sister die for a crime she didn't commit, while the people who were truly guilty, the people who turned grief into accusation and fear into murder, went unpunished." He carefully closed the locket and held it to his chest. "Back then I was just a scared boy. I could do nothing to save her. But I swore, as her body hung from that rope, that one day there would be justice, not the justice of the courts which had failed so completely, but a deeper, more lasting justice." Ezekiel sat back down, his eyes now fixed on Thornton. "I spent years studying, learning. I traveled to faraway places, spoke with people who understood how the human mind works, how guilt can be a force more powerful than any weapon. And then I returned to these mountains and began my work." "Sarah's book wasn't originally about rituals or pacts," Ezekiel continued. "It was just a healer's journal, herbal recipes, ancient prayers our grandmother had taught her. But after Sarah died, I added pages. I created symbols, invented rituals, wrote about curses and sacrifices. I turned an innocent book into a psychological weapon. Then I buried that book where I knew it would be found." Thornton felt nausea rising in his stomach. "You spent decades creating an elaborate trap. And then what? You sought out the descendants of the people who killed your sister." "I didn't have to look far," Ezekiel said. "Guilt has a way of perpetuating itself through generations. Children hear stories from their parents. Grandchildren find old letters. Family secrets come to light. I just had to wait until someone from the right family started asking questions about the past. Then I'd show up, a harmless old hermit, and casually mention that I knew old stories about Sarah Blackwood. I'd talk about a book she'd kept. I'd suggest where it might be found. Once they found the book, the rest took care of itself. The human mind is extraordinary in its ability to find patterns even where none exist. They read about the supposed curse, discovered their family connection to Sarah's death, began to notice coincidences in their lives. An illness, an accident, a financial loss. Any common misfortune became evidence of the curse in action. Ezekiel picked up his mug of tea but didn't drink. He just held it, feeling the heat. I didn't kill these people, Sheriff. They killed themselves, consumed by inherited guilt and irrational fear. I merely provided the fuel. They lit the fire. This isn't justice, Thornton said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. It's psychological torture. It's indirect murder. Innocent children died. 7 children in the Hadley family who had nothing to do with what happened to their sister 40 years ago. No, Ezekiel agreed calmly. It's not justice. I realized that a long time ago, but when you spend decades harboring hatred, building an elaborate vendetta, it's not easy to just stop. It becomes who you are, your reason for being. He finally looked directly at Thornton, and there were tears in his ancient eyes. Every death ate at me, especially the children. But I convinced myself it was necessary, that it was the price the guilty families had to pay, just as my sister paid for a crime she didn't commit. Even Isaiah, Ezekiel continued, his voice now barely a whisper. When I met him, I saw something different in him. He was genuinely good, genuinely devout. He struggled with obsession more than anyone else. I read the letters he sent to the Reverend. I shouldn't have been able to access them, but I have my forms. And when I read his last letter, when I realized he planned to sacrifice not only himself, but his entire family, including little Hannah, just 5 years old. Ezekiel trailed off, unable to continue for a moment. I went up to that cave the night Isaiah planned the ritual. Ezekiel finally said, I arrived late, but still in time to see them. They had all already taken the poison. They were lying in that circle, sleeping their last sleep. Isaiah was barely conscious. He saw me and smiled as if I was some kind of divine herald, confirming he had done the right thing. He said the cycle was finally broken, that no other family would suffer. Ezekiel placed the mug on the table with trembling hands. I stood there as he died. I watched each child's breathing slow until it stopped completely. And it was in that moment, surrounded by 9 innocent bodies, that I finally understood the monster I had become. Sarah would have been horrified. She dedicated her life to saving children, and I spent decades creating situations that led to the deaths of innocent children. I betrayed everything she stood for in the name of a revenge she never would have wanted. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the grate. The men accompanying Thornton looked at Ezekiel with a mixture of horror and something approaching involuntary compassion. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire life to a vengeance that ultimately consumed not only his victims, but also his own humanity. Thornton finally spoke, his voice controlled but thick with emotion. You must answer for this. No matter how tortured your story, no matter what injustice you suffered, 17 people died, including innocent children. You will be taken to Louisburg, tried and most likely hanged, just as your sister was. Ezekiel nodded slowly as if he'd expected it. Yes, I suppose it's fitting, a sort of circle closing. The sister executed for witchcraft she didn't practice. The brother executed for murders he orchestrated through psychological manipulation. There's a poetic symmetry to it. He struggled to his feet. I won't resist. In fact, I feel a strange relief at finally being found out. Carrying this secret for so many decades has been a heavier burden than I imagined. But Thornton had more questions. The book, where is the original now? Isaiah had a copy in the cave, but are there others? Ezekiel walked over to the wooden chest again and removed several volumes. I've made copies over the years. I always needed to have a new one ready for the next victim. These are the last 3. You can destroy them or keep them as evidence. It doesn't matter anymore. Thornton picked up the books and leafed through them. They were meticulous works, each looking genuinely ancient thanks to the techniques Ezekiel had employed to age the paper and ink. You are a skilled craftsman as well as a manipulator, Thornton observed bitterly. How long did it take to create each of these? Months, Ezekiel replied. Each book had to feel authentic, had to carry the weight of history. The symbols had to be complex enough to seem mystical, but not so obscure that they couldn't be interpreted. The instructions for the supposed rituals had to be detailed, but ambiguous, allowing each person to interpret them through the lens of their own fears and guilt. It was a life's work in a sense. One of the men accompanying Thornton, a farmer named Robert Hayes, finally spoke up. What if we hadn't found out? If Isaiah hadn't left those letters for the Reverend, if we'd never connected you to this, how many other families would have been destroyed? Ezekiel looked out the cabin's small window at the mountains stretching in every direction. There were none left. Isaiah was the last direct descendant I could identify. After him, the project would be complete. 17 souls to pay for the 6 children who died of the disease, for Sarah's death, for the years of suffering our family endured. It's cruel math, I admit, and it doesn't really make sense, but it was the logic I had built in my mind over the decades. There was, however, one thing I haven't told you yet, Ezekiel continued, turning to face Thornton directly. Something I discovered too late to change the course I had set. He returned to the chest, and this time pulled out a yellowed envelope. I found this 5 years ago, hidden between the floorboards of the old house where Sarah lived before she was executed. The house had been abandoned for decades, falling into disrepair. I went there one last time before it completely collapsed, searching for any reminder of my sister. Thornton took the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a letter in Sarah's handwriting. He began reading it aloud for all to hear. To whoever finds this, if anyone finds it, my name is Sarah Blackwood, and I will be dead by the time these words are read. I was convicted of crimes I didn't commit, accused of killing children I desperately tried to save. The disease that took them was unknown to me. Resisting all the treatments I knew, I died a little with each child, especially with my own children. The letter continued. I know I will be executed. I know there is no hope of clemency from this community that has turned mourning into hatred and fear into accusation. When they walk with me to the gallows, I will have a choice. I can die in silence, maintaining my dignity to the end. Or I can curse them, utter words of vengeance that will haunt their consciences. I do not yet know which I will choose. But if I choose the curse, I leave this on record now while I'm still in my right mind. Let it be just words. I have no power over the future. I cannot truly curse anyone, but they do not know that, and perhaps their own guilt is curse enough. The letter ended with a request. If I have a brother still alive, Ezekiel, who was 15 when I was arrested, I hope he doesn't carry hatred in his heart. I hope he finds peace, that he builds a life beyond this tragedy. I don't want revenge. I just want to be remembered as I was, a healer who tried to help, a mother who loved her children, a woman who didn't deserve this fate. May God bless those who cursed me, for they know not what they do. Thornton finished reading and looked up at Ezekiel. The old man had tears streaming freely down his wrinkled face. She asked me not to seek revenge, he said, his voice breaking. And I spent 40 years doing just that. I betrayed her dying wish. I betrayed her memory. I betrayed everything she stood for. And for what? The people who killed her died long ago of natural causes. The ones I killed were merely descendants who bore no guilt for their ancestors' crimes. He sank back into his chair, seeming to shrink even further, as if the weight of her confessions were physically crushing him. When I found this letter 5 years ago, I should have stopped. I should have burned the remaining books. I should have let the revenge die. But the hatred had consumed me so completely that I couldn't. I convinced myself that Sarah had written it in a moment of weakness, that she truly wanted justice. But I knew deep down that I was lying to myself. Robert Hayes looked at Thornton. What do we do with him now, Sheriff? Thornton sighed deeply. Well, take him to Louisburg. Like I said, there will be a trial. The evidence will be presented, and then a jury will decide his fate. He looked at Ezekiel. Are you prepared to face that? Yes, Ezekiel said simply. More than ready, in fact. I think it's the only way I can finally find some peace. Sarah faced her execution with dignity, even though she was innocent. The least I can do is face mine while guilty. He stood and held out his wrists. You can handcuff me if you think necessary. I won't run. There's nowhere to run, even if I wanted to. These mountains have been my home and my prison for far too long. Thornton decided not to handcuff him. The man was over 80 years old and could barely walk without difficulty. He wasn't a flight risk. But before they left, he needed to be sure of one thing. Is there something else we should know? Some other hidden truth, some other horror we haven't yet uncovered? Ezekiel thought for a long moment. Just this. Destroy that cave. Seal the entrance. Make it impossible to find, not just because of what happened there, but because places like that harbor darkness. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the human sense. They become places where tragedies are remembered, where troubled people can go to find inspiration for their own obsessions. Don't let it become a monument to madness. The trip back to Lewisburg took 2 full days. Ezekiel Marsh walked slowly, leaning on a staff Thornton had allowed him to bring. During the journey, the old man spoke little, lost in thoughts that likely retraced decades of choices that had led him to that moment. When they finally reached the town, a crowd had already gathered. News traveled fast, and everyone wanted to see the man responsible for the tragedy that had shocked the entire region. Ezekiel Marsh's trial began 3 weeks later in early December of 1834. The courtroom was packed every day. People came from neighboring counties, some walking for days just to witness this historic moment. The prosecutor meticulously presented the evidence, the falsified books, Sheriff Thornton's testimony about the confession, Isaiah's letters showing how he had been manipulated, the testimonies of people who had seen Ezekiel talking to other victims over the years. The defense argued that Ezekiel was insane, that 40 years living alone in the mountains, harboring hatred for the injustice suffered by his sister, had destroyed his ability to reason clearly. Doctors were called to testify about his mental state. Some agreed that there were signs of pathological obsession. Others argued that Ezekiel was perfectly lucid, that he had planned and executed his manipulations with a clarity of purpose that demonstrated sanity, even if morally distorted. Ezekiel himself refused the insanity defense. When he was allowed to speak before the court, he rose with difficulty and addressed the jury in a firm voice. "I am not insane," he said. "I was consumed by hatred and a desire for revenge, but I always knew exactly what I was doing. I calculated every step, planned every manipulation. I cannot and will not hide behind insanity, please. 17 people died because of the seeds I planted in their minds. Their deaths weigh on my conscience, and they should weigh on my sentence as well." He looked around the packed courtroom, his eyes sweeping over the families of the victims present. "I do not ask for forgiveness, for I know I do not deserve it. I do not ask for mercy, for I have shown none. I ask only that my story serve as a warning. Injustice breeds injustice. Revenge brings no peace, only perpetuates cycles of pain. My sister Sarah was innocent, and she was executed. I tried to avenge her death, and ended up causing the deaths of more innocent people. Do not let my existence be completely in vain. Learn from my mistakes." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was expected, but still caused a collective gasp in the courtroom. Guilty of first-degree murder, 17 counts. The judge, a man named Harrison Mitchell, who was 65 years old and had a reputation for severity tempered by wisdom, announced that the sentence would be handed down the following day. That night in his cell, Ezekiel received an unexpected visitor. It was Reverend Morrison, who had traveled from Greenbrier specifically to see him. The 2 men talked for hours. Morrison didn't come to offer condemnation, but rather to try to understand how a human being could lose themselves so completely to darkness. Ezekiel spoke of his childhood with Sarah, of how kind and devoted she had been, of how watching her execution had broken something fundamental within him. "I spent so much time focused on revenge that I forgot how to live," Ezekiel confessed to the Reverend. "I forgot joy. I forgot love. I forgot human connection. All I had left was the plan, the mission, and when each victim died, instead of feeling satisfaction, I felt only emptiness. But I had already gone too far to stop. It was like falling off a cliff. You can't just decide to stop halfway." Morrison listened. And when Ezekiel finished, the Reverend took his old hands and said, "No soul is beyond redemption. What you did was terrible, unforgivable in the eyes of many. But if there is genuine repentance, if there is true acknowledgement of the harm done, then there is hope for peace, even if it comes only in the final moments." They prayed together that night, 2 figures bent with age and the weight of different burdens. The next day, Judge Mitchell handed down the sentence. "Ezekiel Marsh, you have been found guilty of 17 murders. Although your methods were unusual, planting seeds of psychological destruction rather than using direct weapons, the result was the same. 17 people died, including innocent children who never had a chance to live their lives. The law is clear about the punishment for such crimes." He paused, looking directly at Ezekiel. "You will be hanged by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul." The execution was scheduled for December 22nd, a week before Christmas. It wasn't a random date choice, but one that carried symbolic weight, a somber reminder that even in times of celebration and hope, justice must be served. In the days leading up to the execution, Ezekiel remained calm. He received a few visitors, most notably from Reverend Morrison, who continued to offer spiritual comfort. On the morning of the execution, a crowd even larger than that at the trial gathered in Louisburg's central square. There was morbid curiosity, yes, but also a need for closure to see that justice had been served for the victims. Ezekiel was led to the gallows with a slow but steady pace. He refused the hood normally offered to the condemned. He wanted to see heaven one last time, he said. When asked if he had any last words, Ezekiel nodded. His voice, though weak with age, carried clarity. 43 years ago, my sister Sarah was hanged in this very spot for crimes she did not commit. Today I am hanged for crimes I absolutely did commit. The irony is not lost on me, but there is a crucial difference. Sarah died innocent but bitter, cursing those who condemned her. I die guilty but at peace, for I finally understand what she tried to tell me in her last letter. He looked out over the crowd. Revenge does not honor the dead. It does not bring back what was lost. It only creates more death, more pain, more destroyed lives. If my story teaches anything, let it be this. Let hatred die with those who caused the original injustice. Don't pass it on to the next generation. Break the cycle. Don't perpetuate it as I did. The executioner adjusted the rope around Ezekiel's neck. The old man closed his eyes, muttering something that sounded like a prayer. Then the platform fell, and Ezekiel Marsh paid the ultimate price for his actions. They say it was quick, that he suffered nothing. Small consolation perhaps, but more than many of his victims received. In the weeks that followed, Sheriff Thornton fulfilled Ezekiel's final request. He gathered a group of men and returned to the rocky plateau in the mountains. Using gunpowder and heavy tools, they sealed the cave entrance, causing tons of rock to completely cover the opening. Then they removed the stones from the ritual circle and threw them down the cliff, scattering them so they could never be rearranged. They erased all physical traces of that place of tragedy. Sarah Blackwood's original book, along with the copies Ezekiel had created, were publicly burned in the Louisburg town square. The sheriff wanted to be absolutely certain that no trace of those manipulations would survive to potentially deceive another troubled soul in the future. The ashes were scattered to the winds, and with them, it was hoped, the last physical trace of that dark history. But memories cannot be so easily burned. The story of the Hadley family and Ezekiel Marsh has been told and retold over the years in the communities of the Appalachian Mountains. It has become a dark legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unresolved hatred, of revenge that consumes generations, of how trauma can turn into tragedy when not properly processed. The small cemetery, where the 9 members of the Hadley family were buried, has become a place of quiet reflection. Sometimes travelers passing through the area stop there, gaze at the 9 headstones side by side, and contemplate the fragility of human sanity, the weight of inherited guilt, and how easily fear can be weaponized by those who understand its mechanics. As for the Hadley property, it remained abandoned for years. The house eventually collapsed, reclaimed by the forest that had always been there, patiently waiting to reclaim that patch of land. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find the remains of the foundation, stones covered in moss and vines, a silent monument to a family destroyed not by supernatural forces, but by the most human of all weaknesses. The ability to believe our fears are real simply because we want explanations for the inexplicable. And so ends the Appalachian family's most disturbing story, a tale of injustice, revenge, manipulation, and tragedy that unfolded over decades in the dark mountains of West Virginia. There is no happy ending here, no complete redemption, only stark lessons about the cost of hatred and the importance of breaking cycles of pain before they consume everything in their path. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you reflect on the shadows we carry and the legacies we choose to perpetuate or leave behind, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the forgotten depths of American history. Share your thoughts in the comments, your own family stories of secrets and events buried by time. And always remember, mountains hold their mysteries for entire generations, but eventually all truth finds its way to the surface.